Hello. Hello, hello. Welcome. Hola, hola. Gracias, thank you for coming. Today we are starting the new lecture series from Graphic Elisava, and it's really a great pleasure to start the series with Ruben Pater. He's also very happy to start here because he has many Spanish-speaking friends from Spain and from South America, and he told me the first time he's lecturing here, so it's happy about that fact. And I guess that he doesn't need any introduction, like a couple of 2 or 3 years was the Politics of Design, that I think it's a little book that turned all of our heads a little bit upside down. And today we will know about his new publication that I'm sure that it's probably provoking or making think to people like you in the audience about how we can tackle the future of graphic design. So thank you for being here, Ruben.
Thank you. Thank you, gracias. Thank you so much for inviting me also, Mark, and the team from Elisava. And also, I had a little talk with Edu and Serge before for the radio. We talk about design education, and I was also reminded that every time I come to a design school, doesn't matter where I teach in the design school in The Hague, it is very, very nice to see this kind of energy that you can only find in design schools, energy of making and of thinking and of resisting. So I'm happy to be part of that. So I understand also for me, English is not my first language. Maybe for most of you also not. If I'm speaking too quickly, please say slower. So please, so tell me if I'm speaking too fast, or if I'm using words that you don't understand. It's also perfectly fine to ask me to use another word or to explain the word, okay? So I'm going to talk for I think about an hour, maybe a bit longer. Yeah, if you have a question, write it down. I think maybe it's better to keep them until the end, right? Okay. So yeah, we do a little round and we let the microphone pass. So I hope that will fulfill your needs for comments or questions, okay? So a tiny short introduction, maybe that I don't have an academic background. I was a graphic designer. Went to a school such as this one, graphic design school, in Amsterdam, in Breda, and then Amsterdam I did my master later. I worked for 10 years for graphic design studios, commercial, cultural, government, any kind of field imaginable. I worked for McDonald's, I worked for Puma, so everything from the worst to the best I kind of experienced. Internet, print design, everything. So this book mostly comes from my personal experience. How is it to work as a designer? Not just from theory, but from practice. And also for this book, of course, I read a lot of theory, but I tried to translate it in a way that it's accessible for everyone, not just people who have academic degrees. So I hope that comes across. And it's also, of course, very limited because I'm sitting here from a certain part of the world. I am aware that I come from one of the richest countries in the world. So I bring my privilege with me also as a man and as a white man, so I understand that also these things limit my view on the world, right? So, but I try to include many voices in my book as possible, and also try to invite other people to write things, comment to me, and also add on that kind of. So I see this book as a start of a discussion, not as a monument or like a statement or something, right? So let that also be understood that I see like science and also creativity as a collective effort, right? Where you are also part of today, and it's not just like me speaking, but I'm sharing things that I've read and that I've learned, and I hope you will share what you've learned and read too as well, okay? Oh yeah, so why did I write this book, by the way? First of all, there are some reasons to be concerned with the world today. So we have some issue with inequality. We have 2,000 billionaires in the world who have more than 60% of the world population combined. We have 700 million people going hungry on a daily basis, which is growing since 2014. 80% of the world hasn't never flown in an airplane. This is a statistic that always surprises me. Me being from a country where it's quite normal to have flown in an airplane, and 40% does not have access to the internet. And to understand, how to practice design outside of capitalism, the reason for this book making was to understand, most of all, how can I do an ethical practice as a graphic designer, or is that even possible, right? So at the beginning of writing this book, it was not even clear that it was going to end up being a book. It might also have ended up in a failure, being like, I cannot figure it out. Oh, something that went wrong. Edu Rome is asking my attention. Thanks to the European Union. And most of all, why is this important? I was talking also today about it with in the radio show, that we have a problem with the planet being suffocated by our own behavior, and more particularly of the world's richest inhabitants, which are primarily in the global north. And all the calls for sustainable design and better design have not really helped, because we've been discussing this since the 1970s. So this is like the bad news. Sorry about that. So sorry, I have to... all right. All right, so this book. The book is a bit big. It's quite readable though. I heard somebody read it in 7 hours, so it can be done. I wouldn't recommend it though. So the reason, so you cannot talk about design and capitalism in one book, right? It's too big. Everybody told me you cannot do this, but I do still think it's important sometimes to look at like large structures and how they are related, and then within these things you can go deeper and further, right? So the idea is a little bit to kind of go over the surface on each and every point, and then people can read further and inspect further on each issue. So the first part of the book is mostly about how designers, graphic designers, but I think this goes for visual communication in general, create documents that the economy needs. So the most obvious example are bills, contracts, etc., right? But also advertisements, brands, things that we need to create a market, to create demand for that market. So the second part is, that is often not so discussed when we talk about design, is that designers are also people who work. And there are bosses, and there are entrepreneurs, and there are students, and there are teachers. So there are economic actors, and they shape the way we look at work and we practice work. Then the last part is more about the things that kind of come from design, like social design, speculative design, design activism, things that have recently emerged, although their roots are much older, about why haven't we been able to kind of break this cycle, the caps lock cycle, the interlocking of consumption and destruction, creating new visual identities, destroying the letterheads, creating a new visual identity, etc., creating waste, etc., and all these things. And what kind of strategies have come forward from that? So anyway, I'll touch upon a few of those in today. So the designer as scribe is for me where it starts, because the oldest forms of graphic design, so written, produced communication, was not writing at all, but was accounting. So this is a receipt of beer. To be more precise, it's not like a receipt from like a cerveceria, but it's more like a receipt for storing of beer in Mesopotamia. All right, so I'm going to have to turn off the Wi-Fi because this is not going to work. Sorry. Disculpe. But already you see here that scribes in Mesopotamia, so we're talking about cities that housed thousands of people. They needed a kind of way to track down, goods. I owe you so much barley, you owe me to this, and then people use these clay tablets. So this is only 9 centimeters by, let's see, 6.8 centimeters. So this is quite small, right? So you see that also already the scribes that were creating these documents were quite schooled. Even though there's not a writing system, you see there's already kind of layout going on. There's like the way that the digits are aligned. So we already see the kind of first forms emerging of economic transaction. So now why is this important? Why do I bring up this Mesopotamia thing? So because what I learned through writing this book, that economy is not like some kind of abstract thing that you find in a newspaper or that politicians talk about when they talk about, raising your rent or raising your water price. It's just things people do together, We are people and we do things together. We, grow food, make posters, you know, we hang out, we do all these things, and many of these activities are economic activities. They create something, and they are as a form of value exchange, right? And whether that's money done in money or not, it's a social relation. So economy needs like documents to relate that socially, because if this would be just the world, we wouldn't need graphic design, right? We would just tell, Mark, yesterday I borrowed some beer from you, today I'm gonna pay it back. We don't need to write it down, right? Because I know you. But if we are with, you know, billions of people, we start to need these kind of documents. So you see with the scaling of societies that graphic documents start to be introduced to mediate these social relationships. But sometimes we forget that these documents are just a mediation of social relationship. You know, we all know that in your family, you don't use like a contract when you borrow something from your mom, or at least normally I don't think you do, right? Because there's this trust aspect. So I think we sometimes lose in the production of design from this industrial standard. We get lost this idea of that it's mostly about a social relationship. Now, back to the creating of these documents. So this is the first bills ever made in Europe. So this is from 1666 from Sweden. So you see that graphic design becomes also a way of preventing counterfeiting. Because if I have this bill and I can just write it also myself on a piece of paper, then yeah, people are not going to believe it. So you see they use the printing press as a technology. Not everybody had access to that. They use really sophisticated writing. They use things like autographs. They use things like stamps. Actually, all of these things that are still part of what we... this is, by the way, not the first bill. This is a Dutch East India first stock. This is the one I was talking about. But the kind of basic idea is similar, that you see that the basic design of a banknote has not changed so much. This is like literally a note from the bank because it was too heavy to carry all the coins. But we see actually that design is mostly used as a technology to safeguard this economic transaction, because it's not just about mediating this economic relationship with people, but also to make it secure. So we trust the state and the bank, you know? This is why we need graphic designers, and this is why banknotes are not set in Comic Sans, right? Or not printed on toilet paper, written by hand or something. This is kind of important. And we see the same thing with how sentences are created, where you need a document where you're born, so we can look up who you are. And it becomes very annoying when you have to prove to, when you move to another country, proving yourself who you are, having to find your document somewhere and paying a lot of money to a notary. So the way that we write down economic systems started to like relate into this kind of like list of numbers that we know now from the stock market, right? So on the left we see the Prijscourant. This is like one of the first kind of price current economic newspapers from Amsterdam from 1636, which basically lists the value of all the commodities where were traded, or well, in the colonial conquest were kind of like traded in the Dutch stock exchange. And you still see the same kind of notation on the right here in a more contemporary newspaper, Scotland Herald. Now, the basic question is about this is that, so of course we need mathematics and we need Excel sheets and we need this kind of computation, because this is also how we know that climate change is happening, by measuring ice cores and collecting data and computing all this data. So we need this, right? But if I'm a trader and I'm looking at this screen, I'm just seeing profit, loss, yes, no, sell, buy. But because we just learned that because economy is based on human social relations, between every number, behind every number, there's somebody's house, somebody's job, or an animal being slaughtered, or, you know, all of these things are hidden behind those numbers. So you see that the graphic notation also serves as a way to dehumanize economics and make it easier, for example, what happened after the 2008 crisis, and I'm pretty sure it also happened here, but for example, in the United States, you had whole neighborhoods where people were kicked out of their house. And then the houses were just empty because they were immediately bought by the same investors waiting for the price to go up. So then you have people living on the street in the neighborhood while the houses are empty. If we were a community, that would never happen, because that would make absolutely no sense. When I would only have the one, where I would be the only one with a house and you would all be homeless, you know, you would like not take that, right? But in capitalist global system, we can do that because it's always like, no, but because it's happened in America. And in America, it's like, no, because it happened in China. It happened because of... So everybody's pointing to somebody else. And in the end, it's like the system, you know, and we're not part of the system. So it's this dehumanizing aspect that makes things like slavery and exploitation so easy and so very well possible, even though probably everyone in the world is individually against that. The system makes that ultimately possible because it dehumanizes the social relations. And my point is that design documents play a very important role in dehumanizing that relationship, right? So, of course, the big question is how can we do it differently? I'm not proposing to get rid of numbers or mathematics. I'm not proposing anything like that. Like, I'm not some kind of like crazy back to nature person. But this is, for example, an interesting project from Gapminder in Sweden, where you have a website that actually talks about income of families in the world, which is about statistics and economy, the two most boring subjects probably in any school. But then they put photographs there. So you don't just see what makes this family from Burundi and from the Philippines, you see also how they live, their dog, you see what they eat, you know, you see what their living room looks like, and immediately you have a different relationship with that number. And I think this is the kind of relationship that we miss in the way that we discuss economics. And also when you look at an economics page in the newspaper, it's only infographics and numbers, right? And there might be some human interest stories, but you realize that there's an intrinsic lack of representation of economic relations in our society because we have seen economics as a mathematical exercise, right? All right, so now we're going to go to a little bit more applied and maybe more relatable topic, which is branding. So I wouldn't say that branding is something that we would never use or never like. When I see this box of Miller beer from the United States from like the 1800s or the 1900s, yeah, I don't have such a big problem with this kind of branding. I mean, you see, it looks pretty nice. You see it's a box. You can still use the box after you use it. And on the right, you see this idea of the grocer, right? Before the supermarket, you would buy your food at a grocer, and you would like buy a bar of soap, but the soap would not have a brand on it, right? It would just be soap. And beans would just be beans. Or so you would just like take a scoop of frijoles. That's what you take home, right? So you were like less busy with this idea of branding. And branding really came to this kind of colonial enterprise where there's a really interesting book where they talk about that the British and I think the French were fighting to put their soap on the market because soap was made from palm oil, from all these colonial things, and they needed to push their products to keep this kind of colonial thing going. So it's really related to this this way where it was scaled up. So, and now when we go to a supermarket, we see this, right? And there's this idea that capitalism has given us this choice in foods, you know, like in the Netherlands, when I go to the supermarket now, there are like 18 types of peanut butter, right? Like this is, I mean, we don't need 18 types of peanut butter, but even more, it's also the illusion of choice because most of these products are owned by a handful of companies and they create products within one product range that are competing with one another. So I was also talking before in the radio show where I spent most of my career as a designer designing like logos and visual identities. And none of them still, I worked for 10 years at a design studios and none of these identities I think still exist. Because, and it's not that the identity that I made was not good enough or it was not timeless enough. No, it's the company gets taken over by another company or it wants to appear more new. You know, if you think about like the Spanish state telecom, how many times it has rebranded and being taken over, and every time the rebranding is nothing happens in the company, the phone systems don't change. It's just the appearance, and this is what we're good at, right? And this is what makes graphic design so valuable in the capitalist market because graphic designers, as no one else, is able to completely rebrand something that already exists and is completely the same in a new way, right? And it's the cheapest way of doing it. You don't need to change production or neither hire new people. You just paint it a new color, right? That's the point. And of course, now we see that branding has become much more than that. It has become like a religion. You know, we adore brands. Brands kind of start to replace things like kinship in communities and religions. And like that's a whole nother story, but that all elevates branding. And that happened with the way that production was outsourced, and companies like Nike and Apple don't actually produce computers or shoes anymore. Not legally. Legally, those are produced by companies in China like Foxconn or in Bangladesh that are independent contractors, and actually what Nike and Apple do is they create intellectual property. They create ideas, right? And this is what designers do. We create ideas, these ideas we sell, and then somebody else produces those things, and then we can, you know, earn a lot of more money in that basis. But we also have to take into account the violent history of the word branding, which of course comes from branding an animal or a human. And especially in slavery times, and this happened a lot also with the Dutch colonial conquest, is the idea of branding slaves according to a whole system of regulations that kind of sounds like a corporate identity now. And sorry, I will not stay here. This is a pretty dramatic story. But I still think it's important to tell because that whole thing is like turning a living being, whether it's an animal or a human, through torture into a product is precisely what branding does. Branding can turn everything into a product. You know, graphic designers can turn air or sand into a product. Like, we know how to do that. This is water, you know? I mean, we can brand water. I mean, this is how much? 219 euros for 75 milliliters of water. You know, so this is what the power of branding, you know? So I think this is like, so we have to understand that the process of branding in its extreme can be a violent process, can be a process of, because if at the moment you brand water, you also say water is not free anymore. And suddenly you have places in the world where people have no access to clean water, but companies are getting water from their very own rivers and mountains and selling it, right? So that's when we have this idea of the commons, which are things that should be accessible to all of us, but are suddenly privatized and we have to buy to receive them, right? So this is, I think, this is why I want to make this connection with this process of the branding and the violence behind it. And you see the same thing, of course, with city branding, where, you know, cities do not need logos. They are already identities that have cultural and significance. But then what you realize when I did research after the I Love New York logo, which is in the book also, you realize that these are actually gentrification machines. Because the logos ultimately want to attract more foreign tourists and more industry, and want to get rid of citizens that cost money and do not bring taxpayer money, which are poor citizens and also often people of color. So this process of gentrification, pushing people outside of the city and bringing in wealthier people, is something that needs design. You know, so the relationship between design and things like Richard Florida's book, which was so important, The Rise of the Creative Class from 2002, these are exactly the kind of things that we see with the city branding, which are ways to push access to the city away for poor people and have the cities made more expensive and gentrified, which is something I think is related in Barcelona with the 1992 Olympics, which I haven't actually read about yet, but I find very interesting, because I think the way of the gentrification in Barcelona is also quite violent in itself as well. I mean, I was very surprised about hearing the rent cost in Barcelona compared to the wages here. Yeah, so this is ultimately what we get, right? We get this kind of like society where it's perfectly normal to have houses that are empty because they're just investments. You know, housing is not a right, it's a market. So it's perfectly normal in a capitalist society to leave complete neighborhoods empty because they are still waiting to accumulate value for the investor and having people live on the streets. Because people do have like some kind of human right for the roof, but the right of capital supersedes that, right? In legal terms. All right. So we come now a bit to the middle part of the book, which is more, so now I was talking a little bit more how the work of designers kind of bolsters, supports capitalism and also the protection of capital. Also, we cannot see housing as a property without having cadastral documents, right? Cadastral maps. Maps that show who owns what, and documents that trace that, and see land as ownership. You know, why do we see land as ownership? Many indigenous cultures do not see land as ownership because you share it with nature, with history, with the future, You know, if you pollute land right now, the future will have to deal with that. So land is always related to future and past and ecology, which is not part of the, at least the Dutch way of seeing land, which is land as property, and the owner can do with it what he or she pleases if it stays within the realms of the law, right? So when we talk about designers, well, like I said, I worked in design studios for 10 years as a worker, as a, well, not as a boss, but I did, you know, hire occasionally people to help me or to assist me. I had interns. I worked for different studios. I was a freelancer. I'm still a teacher. So in all these capacities. And I think it's also good to talk about design work because this is also the future of many of you, I think, or already the present. So roughly speaking, you know, the big change in design work happens with the Industrial Revolution, right? The word design actually also comes from that time. And that doesn't mean there was no visual communication before. You know, there was a stone found in Navarra in Spain 17,000 years ago, which was a rock had scribbles on it, and they found out it's a map. You know, visual communication is not new. We didn't invent visual communication in the 19th century. This visual communication has been always part of human culture, just as art has been in all other kinds of cultural production. So if you see this print shop in the 1580s in the Netherlands, you see that the production and the design and often even the writing of print work, let's take print as an example here, is done under the same roof, right? So the relationship between design and production is very clear. It all happens on the same roof. You could not study design. Design was considered, or printing in this case, was considered a working class job. I mean, it was something you could not study. There were no textbooks, you know. You learned it in your family, you know, office, or if you were lucky, could be like a journeyman or an apprentice, and you can join a workshop. Not that this was kind of some kind of romantic fantasy, because there was a lot of also abuse in terms of patriarchy and the role of the church, right? So we should not romanticize this way of working. But what we see is the moment we scale up the Industrial Revolution, we see suddenly that the designers start to be in a different part of the factory. So you have like the floor, you know, with the printers, but the designers are no longer there. It becomes a separate profession. So this is basically when the design profession is starting. And designers, the quick rise of industrial production needed designers to give stories to these products, and this is how design became its kind of profession. And I quote this in my book. There was one copywriter who worked for advertising who said, yeah, you don't want to really go to the factory floor, because once you see how things are produced, you cannot write, you know, the bullshit that you need to sell it. You know, so this taking apart of the production of the design was necessary, you know, because early industrial production was not pretty, you know, and the industrial production is still not pretty if you go to low-wage countries and this kind of horrible conditions of production that we still see, for example, how our clothing is made. And what we see now is we see that the design office, especially in product and fashion design, is completely disconnected from the production. The production is done far away on other continents by companies we don't know, we cannot visit, or often very much like, so it's again this abstraction and dehumanization of the relationship in this case between design and production, right? So why is that a problem? Because on some level this makes things very efficient and a lot cheaper, but on the other hand we also see, like, you know, I ask people who designed the iPhone, and people say this is Jonathan Ive, he was a designer for Apple Computer, or Steve Jobs and Jonathan Ive. But nobody ever talks about all the interns at Apple and all the design assistants and all the different designers who were involved in all parts of the project, which I'm sure are more than, you know, 30, 40 people. But also who actually makes the iPhones, because it's kind of important to make a good product that you have good manufacturing, right? Who makes these machines, who did all this, but these people are never mentioned when you look up who designed the iPhone, you know. And we all know that production is a very important part of design. It's not the same, but knowing production as a printmaker, for example, is very, very important. To make a good book, you have to know how to talk to a printer, how printing works. You know, you have to be there on the workshop floor to see what's going on with the ink and everything. So the idea of this craft is still related to this idea of production, of quality, right? But we never mention the people who are actually, you know, made the iPhones in our pockets. The people who actually assembled them are never part of this story of design. So the story of design tries to create this image where the designer, there's a few star designers, those are the geniuses that we celebrate, and then the rest of the people are just not as good, or they're just doing production, right? And I think this is kind of harmful for the idea that we organize ourselves in the design industry. And that also gets a bit more difficult when we start to, tell each other to work harder and harder, like this famous poster from Anthony Burrell, work hard, this is your passion, work weekends, work nights. I mean, I did all these things and it didn't really make me a better person or a better designer, And I'm not saying that there's something wrong with it, because I love doing design, and sometimes I'm in a project, I'm like working and it's great and I'm loving it, and that's fine, but it shouldn't be something that should be like, that we have to do. Because not everybody is going to be a famous star designer, But that doesn't mean that all of us have to like suffer, because what we see among designers as well, we see rising burnouts, rising rates of depression. Also in schools, I've seen it also in The Hague, where students are saying, I'm sorry, we cannot do all of this and also make our website and also keep our Instagram account and also have a social life, Like, we are demanding a lot of ourselves and of each other. And we have to really wonder, insofar that it's actually helping us, together to, be good human beings. And what also does this hard work, what purpose does it serve in the end, right? And this also comes really from Silicon Valley, where for example, this is from Facebook. They give this book to new employees: the quick shall inherit the earth, this is a meme I made. Where do you get time for sleep if you have to do your email, your Instagram? And also what we should also talk about is domestic and reproductive labor, right? Because a lot of these work relations is like, okay, so the best paid job in design is marketing consultant. But there's many unpaid jobs in design or in creative professions that are unpaid. I'm talking about people who work for activist organizations, who do a lot of pro bono work, or for the art world, but also, I don't know, teaching your children how to draw or how to paint, Sounds to me a lot more important than what a marketing consultant does in terms of beneficial for society. But one type of work is unpaid, unvalued. You cannot put it on your resume. You cannot say, I spent the last 4 years, raising my children, Can you give me a job now as a designer? Although you might actually be more skilled in, educating and teaching design than somebody with many degrees, for example. So there's also this really sexist and repressive form where we think some types of things are work and others are not. If it's not paid for, it's not work. Well, I don't know, if you have to cook and have to clean and if you have raised children, that's work. That should be paid, that should be valued, So also the way we organize work in our society, and this is a work by the See Red Women's Work Swap, which is a feminist graphic design collective from the 1970s from the UK. Very amazing work, you should check out their book. And I think this image shows it really well, right? So also when we talk about work, we should also take into account the unpaid reproductive labor. I don't know, the famous designers from the history books, which are unfortunately mostly men that are usually featured in these monographs. Okay, who was raising their children? Who was cooking their food? Were they doing it themselves? Or what made them have all this time to do all this design, right? And also a more important point is, what do we see as design and what not? So this is Ernesto Oroza. He's from Cuba. He's now teaching in France. He sent me all this stuff from Cuba, and I think it's really important also to understand that, like, when you see speakers at design conferences, almost invariably they are professional designers. That means they have access to a degree, they have access to paid work, right? But that doesn't mean that in communities that have no access to design education, or it's simply too expensive, they don't have visual communication. I'm not going to say that this is not design and what Apple does is design. That makes no sense. But if it's not valued monetarily, if it's not done by the industry, then suddenly it's not design anymore, and this is not valued. So I think we need an expansion of the idea of design, where we include everybody who has creative abilities and uses them in a way that serves visual communication. I think that would make the profession a lot more interesting, and also a lot less reliant on things like multinationals and big companies, right? And how we create value with that is another story, but I think this is also important that, I mean, I never see like a design conference or a design award where like somebody who wasn't schooled in design and doesn't make money with design still gets an award. And if they do, it's a professional designer who finds these people, like I do now showing this, who has access to, speaking here at Elisava, showing this, right? Who shows something by Ernesto Oroza, who did made himself, who made photographs of a person who made this, whose name I don't know, right? So this is already this way. So a more healthier way of looking at work, that work is not something by itself that is good or good for us. We need to work to survive thanks to the capitalist system, right? But there are ways to work better and to work less, and to understand work as a different form. Work is ultimately people doing stuff together, right? And I would rather happen that in a more natural fashion, also the way it's valued, than the way that it's organized right now. Because also, like, a lot of the best design work is usually not the best paid design work. So there's this really strange correlation between what is valued in society. Like, I worked for banks, they always pay the best. Like, I don't know, like, why would banks have so much money? They always paid like 100,000 euros to make like one flyer. And then you work for a cultural institution, and they say like, yeah, we have like a few thousand euros for the whole identity. And then as a studio, you kind of balance that out, but that, makes no sense in terms of what society takes from that and where that money comes from. And where is all this hard work going to? So this is a famous graph used by David Harvey in A Brief History of Neoliberalism, which I can highly recommend if you're interested in reading economic theory, Marxist theory. So what we see is that worker productivity, which means how fast and how quickly workers produce things, whether it's designs or apples in a factory or whatever, or clothes. So you see that productivity and wage, which is how much you get paid, goes up, and then we see the beginning of neoliberalism in the 1970s. So what happens in the global north, this is from the US, industries massively get outsourced, right? Because it's cheaper to produce in Mexico, it's cheaper to produce in Asia, whatever. So a lot of industries are being outsourced, and then the power of unions is broken by neoliberal politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and we had them in the Netherlands, and you probably had them in Spain as well. And then you see that productivity keeps going up, but wages plateau, right? So my parents' generation, it was still possible to do a working class job with only one household breadwinner, which was usually the man, which is the capitalist model, the nuclear family, obviously. And you would be able to buy a house and support a whole family on one salary, no mas, right? In the Netherlands, this is completely not possible. I mean, if you have if you are together and you have both of you have a job, even then it becomes difficult to buy a house in Amsterdam, for example, right? So where is all this hard work going to if we don't have access to the kind of salary? Well, here. So the CEO to worker pay ratio in 1965 was 20:1, and now it's 320:1. So where is all this money going to the 6,000 richest billionaires in the world? Ultimately, all this money is going to real estate, to investment, to all these type of things that make a lot more money than working, because working will not make you rich. Everybody knows that. So you have to beat the system, get into real estate, get into, I don't know, emissions trading or whatever, NFTs. But I just want to point out that working hard will only make other people rich. So keep that in mind also when people tell you, no, this is just how we have to do things, or this is just expected of you because we do these things this way, right? So understand for yourself what you find by work, what is meaningful for you, and how to survive, because of course we have to pay our rents and we have to, put food in our mouths. So we need to understand we need to work and we need to have jobs that pay, but be smart about how you work and also what you can do to, resist exploitation in the workplace. Let me see. I'm going a bit over time. So I'm going to do, are you interested? I have one thing about social design and then I have like an end you want to hear. Okay, you're not tired, you're not, all right. Thank you for bearing with me. So yeah, the point is also sometimes people, they know what I write about and they're like, yeah, but social design, let's change the world with design. Now, I'm all for using your skills to make the world a better place. We try to do that, all of us, I think, in a way. Of course, social design is, by virtue of Victor Papanek, became like a sort of movement. Excellent book, by the way, 1972. But Victor Papanak was from Austria. He lived in the United States, and there is an aspect of this philanthropy, this idea of philanthropy, which is not necessarily Victor Papanek, but this idea of philanthropy is the rich person helping the poor person, right? This is what philanthropy is. And there's always this part of mission work, you know? So this is the colonial times when Dutch people, Spanish people, Portuguese people, we went all over the world, taking people's lives, their livelihood, their land, everything, but then saying, no, we're bringing you civilization. We're bringing you language, we're bringing you religion, etc. So this idea, and we still have this kind of mission work coming out from the Netherlands, we're going to help the people in Africa, you know. So this idea of the white savior complex, the person of privilege helping the unprivileged is very strong in this, and this is a very colonial, long-standing narrative that we have to imagine. So what we have now is we have Facebook billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg who says, yeah, but I'm not going to pay taxes because taxes are go to the government. The government is inefficient. I'm going to avoid paying taxes, and I'm going to set up my own charity. So he set up Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is together with his wife. And he said he can eradicate disease by 2050, all diseases. Now, Mark Zuckerberg is a software engineer. He's not a medical professional. Also, I think we already have institutions that try to eradicate diseases, but they're paid with taxpayers' money, which we have less of now. So what Dean Spade says, Dean Spade wrote a book called Mutual Aid, what I get back into later. So they say the charity model reinforces the idea that rich people are inherently better and more moral than poor people. This is why they deserve to be on top. And philanthropy reinforces this idea that rich people are simply better because they have more money, right? So this is deeply rooted in this idea of philanthropy. Because you always expect something in return, right? For example, Mark Zuckerberg wants to spend the money he wants this way. Because if he pays taxes, society kind of like thinks about what do we spend the money on. But if he wants to spend your money on something, and billionaires always say, no, but we know much better than you. You know, we know much better than governments, right? So this is the privatization also of welfare. In the Netherlands, this led to this kind of behavior in terms of design, and I can completely understand. This is about having good intentions will not necessarily yield good results, right? So I'm not questioning the good intentions of Mark Zuckerberg. I'm convinced he probably really wants to eradicate disease. I just don't think he's the right person necessarily to do that. So in the Netherlands, we have this festival called What Design Can Do. This is a social design festival. And in 2014, as you well know, there was the so-called refugee crisis, which basically meant many countries, also among the Netherlands, were throwing bombs on Syria and Iraq. Being in a place that's being bombed is not so nice, so people fled that place and they went to look for better places. For example, in Europe, so many refugees came to Europe, and this was called a crisis, and the idea was designers can help the refugee crisis. So this was called the Refugee Challenge, and people everywhere in the world could send in designs to help. And they made all these examples like, you can make a shelter, or you can create a better understanding as a graphic designer of the role of refugees to make sure people don't start like hating refugees, and talking about all these kind of design problems, right? And they were not necessarily saying that we can solve it, but they did say, but designers can do what governments and NGOs cannot do anymore, right? So they also follow this privatization idea that helping people should be done by the market, because designers are the market, right? Like we are usually, running businesses. We are the private sector. All right, so 635 people sent in designs. I didn't look at all of them. I'm also not going to talk about all of them. And 20 of those designs were selected from this kind of like Dragon's Den, thing, and they would get 10,000 euros some of them to make the idea better, right? And what you see is, although refugees were encouraged to participate, most of the designers were from the global north. So you have, designers from the Netherlands designing for refugees. So you see that the person designing is somebody else than receiving the design, right? You already feel where I'm going with this. All right, a few examples of and I have to say these are the 20 selected projects from the 635, right? So this is by Luke Escobar, who is an architect from the United States. So he wants to kind of how do you say, like, kill two flies with one stone? I don't know. He wants to solve two problems with one design solution because he wants to address the desertification of the south of Europe, also in the south of Spain, and the south of Italy, where there's a problem with desertification. So he wants the refugees to work in work camps in the desert to make this land ready again for European citizens to start farming. And then they go off to the next work camp. I'm not sure how this will improve the lives of refugees. I'm also not sure if you flee from Syria and you're like a brain surgeon or any other profession that you would like to work in the desert. It sounds to me like a prison work camp, but yeah. It's not so well thought out, but so these are the kind of designs that designers come up with, right? And this is the complete misunderstanding of the history of colonialism, what happened in the Middle East, why there's war there, what European countries had to do with that we have a border around Europe, as you know, in Ceuta, Melilla, where we put fences to keep refugees out, where we do not allow people from places like Syria to fly to Europe, which would be obviously, you know, let's say, would be preferable over dying in the Mediterranean. The most deadly border in the world is between Europe and Africa. 33,000 deaths since 2000, right? But the reason we don't allow that because you need to have a visa and the European Union doesn't want people to come. So we spend all our time preventing people to come, and we give a little bit of money to this social design festival to come up with these ideas that look very nice, you know. These two are not so nice that I'm showing, but there were some that were a little bit more, you know, photogenic. This is from a Dutch collective, Refugees Got Talent. Yeah, but I mean, so for me it's also not about shaming these individual designers. I just think it's like a fundamental wrong briefing and wrong framing of this whole issue. So yeah, there's a, well, maybe I don't even need to explain why this is bad. And also, I also want to point out we spent a lot of money on keeping people out of Europe. You know, we have Frontex, 400 million a year. We have fences. Those are all designed. We have Dutch designers from the technical university designing smart sensors, you know, working with drones, working with all this smart technology to find refugees as soon as possible and to employ the military and to keep people out of Europe. You know, this is what we're already doing. We're designing people out of Europe, you know, so yeah, this is one of these technological drone systems, which is, by the way, a very interesting visualization of a possible scenario, which almost looks like two continents that look familiar. Yeah, and also we know, yeah, the way this Fortress Europe is being like funded by military European companies like Thales, Airbus, etc. It's clear. All right, so sorry to drag you down in this kind of this period, but I think this is also important that social design, this is not talking about all social design, but we have to be very careful not to be in this position of a naive white savior complex. Yeah, but doing something is better than doing nothing. You know, this is what we have to really avoid. So what is a more ethical, a more proper, I don't know, approach if you want to like help with design or help at all other people? So mutual aid is it's an anarchist concept. It's from Kropotkin, but it's actually much older. It's basically how people help each other, right? So if you have a family and somebody in your family needs something, you help because they're your family or in your friend groups, etc. You can do that on a larger scale. This is, for example, the Black Panthers in the 1960s and 70s. The US federal government and local government was not really helping black communities as they were helping white communities. So what do you do if the state is not giving you the education and the health that your children need? You start organizing it yourself. They were feeding like 15,000 children, it's in my book somewhere, at one point. This was a massive operation to give breakfast to children before they went to school. They all did that for their own communities. It was not like I'm designing for somebody else. No, these are my own children. I'm helping my own community, right? So this is putting yourself outside of this community you're helping, that is the issue. So mutual aid is basically not asking like, oh, I want to help people in Africa with my design. What's happening in your own neighborhood? What's going on? If your neighbor gets evicted because your neighbor cannot pay the rent, are you going to help out or not? Maybe there's not going to be design involved, but it's going to be a lot more effective and it's going to be a lot more interesting for you also to get to know people in your community and to help them in a way that is actually more respectful to your neighbors or the people that you are helping, because the idea of mutual aid is I help you and you help me, right? So one of the ways that I think we saw this also during COVID is people helping each other, doing groceries, you know, like I think this was beautiful. And this is also the way that we see that we did not destroy this part of social life. You know, we still do this. We still know how to help each other without paying somebody to do it or relying on the state to do it, you know? And I think this is like central to how we can kind of really think about design as being a different form of social interaction for the benefit of the community, and not necessarily me as an individual want to profit from solving a global issue, which looks good on my website, looks good on Instagram, but ultimately does not help anybody at all, because I'm actually mostly busy with improving my own portfolio or the way I'm perceived outside of my, you know, professionally, because I'm helping somebody, right? And I also want to point out that, so these examples from the refugee challenge are pretty horrible. There's also some really interesting examples from there, and I also don't want to like paint kind of some broad stroke picture about this, right? But I want to point out the difference between helping each other, or I am somebody of privilege helping somebody who's unprivileged, and the power dynamic that is part of that, because the power dynamic is what becomes the issue. All right, so this is the final part and the more positive part. So I hope this will also leave you with a feeling that you have still some, you know, I don't know, some reason to be here at the school. So, of course, this idea of design activism is already now being, unfortunately, also appropriated by capitalism. Yeah, I mean, we see this with this kind of idea of the pink washing and the green washing of what many companies are doing. You know, like I mentioned before, it's cheaper to put a green logo or a rainbow logo than it is to actually change your, violent ways of doing business. But, things are happening. We have a Google union now. I mean, that's amazing. I did not expect that was going to happen. There's also, I mean, I was talking also with unions. I know that graphic designers are thinking about this, are working about this. A union doesn't necessarily have to be what it was in the 70s and the 80s. The unions also did many things not right. Unions do not have a very positive image in the Netherlands because they became too much, part of the system. But the union is just basically organizing, So if, for example, too much work, people are paying too low fees to freelance designers, graphic designers in Barcelona, try to get 500 designers into a space and discuss what are the issues, how do we do this? Can we just make sure that we just refuse to do this, to refuse to work for these low, because now we have like a race to the bottom in terms of freelance prices, at least in the Netherlands. Maybe you have the same thing here. A lot of designers being automated. So sooner or later, it's going to be harder and harder to make a living using design. And we can try to, be each other's competitors, but that's only going to serve the clients who have more and more people to choose from for lower and lower prices. So instead of doing that and saying, no, I can do it for free. I can do it, I will give you actually a bonus. But maybe try to understand that this will actually not in the long term improve the economic relationship of designers and the way of surviving, But because at some point it's not going to last a lot longer. So we have to understand that we have to organize at some point, if only to make sure that exploitative practices like unpaid pitches, unpaid internships are not happening anymore, right? And also that we have a lot of these events that are sponsored by big businesses, by industries, awards that you basically buy an award, you just have to pay a lot of money to also understand that design is not a competition, It's a way to culturally inform society and to create things together because we think these things are necessary for society, or we simply think they make society more beautiful. So to have a more kind of social grounding of the terms of design, and not only related, it has to be made for a multinational and it has to be made by a famous designer, otherwise we are not interested in what you have to say, right? And I think there's some room for that. I think we see a lot of also speakers at conferences who are not so famous or not only busy with this, but I still think it's very strongly there because all these awards have a business model, right? There's an interesting union in the UK you can check out. It's called United Forces of the World. They started actually organizing like writers from Deliveroo and people like that. And they also include now creative workers, cultural workers. I think it's very interesting. I mean, we were talking about that Barcelona in 1936 had 2,000 cooperatives. I mean, this was Ciudad Obrero you know, that's pretty amazing that was once possible here. So the idea of a cooperative, having a studio without bosses, I think is a really interesting way of working differently. How do you take design decisions when you work on consent or consensus basis instead of working with a top-down hierarchy with one person who makes all the money in the company and the rest who are basically, yeah, you know, you go until senior designer and then you're kind of like stuck in the design ceiling, you know, and above you people have a marketing degree or business degree. This happens in Holland a lot. And I don't have really an answer how to do that. Because I also don't know, and it also will change per country, per region, per street, maybe even. But I did interview 6 collectives in my book. One of them is Cooperativo de Diseño from Argentina. They are a feminist collective working from IMPA, which is a collectivized cooperative for metal workers. So they do part of their work actually for this factory, but they also create a lot of work that is feminist and anti-abortion, pro-abortion in terms of legalizing the abortion. And they're really also part of this discussion on gender and politics in Argentina, which is really nice. And they can make a living. You know, Argentina is not known for having like lush subsidies for designers as they do in the Netherlands. So I think the fact that they can do this there, I think, is really amazing. This is from the UK. Common Knowledge is a co-op. They're really interesting because they work only with digital platforms. They try to see digital platforms as ways of organizing activists and also organizing together. And the idea that back-end and front-end systems can be also systems of empowerment. How do activist organizations reach more people? How can we create critical mass? They create this website called Vent Your Rent, where you can complain about your landlord, talk about what you're paying, you know. Also to gather data from society to lay bare the problems that are actually occurring. Also a cooperative. This is open source publishing from Brussels. They work only with open source software. It's very challenging. I've tried it for a while. It's very challenging. You need a lot of time and a lot of programming skills. It's not for everyone, but I think it's really interesting that you can design without Adobe. You know, you can design without using the platforms of multinationals, about open platforms that people can use. And they also do the same thing with their work. So their work is all for free, accessible online, all their typefaces, you can fork them, you can... and also if they work with a client, what they call them collaborator, they also publish all the sketches online of the whole process. I thought that was amazing. You know, designers never do that. It's like, no, we leave that for the presentation to show the sketches. No, you never do that. You only show the final result. You never show the whole process. So to be transparent about this process, I think is a really interesting way of working. And they work with platforms like Nextcloud. They have this whole philosophy, how they work, and they share all their experiences on their website. It's a very rich resource. And the last one I want to share is The Public from Toronto in Canada. They are a collective of queer and trans and people of color community designers that were really about, we're going to bring like design to this communities. But then they realized, but there's already creativity and design in every community. We are not the only ones who have, you know, we have the sole right to creativity because we happen to have this degree. So they started to change a little bit to become more facilitators, doing workshops, inviting people from the neighborhood. And also they have like a gallery in their building in the bottom where they show work from people in the community. And they also realized the importance of designers in the gentrification process. You know, designers open an office somewhere and a few years later they go to another neighborhood where it's more cool or more hip. And they were like, no, so we're going to stay here. You know, we are the community. We are going to work with the community. We're going to stay here. This is our home. These people are our people. And I think that also takes, you know, guts, because for a long time I think we had this narrative of designers being, I'm now in Berlin, I'm now in New York, I'm in Japan, I'm so nomadic and international and global and like celebrating this kind of like design lifestyle for the like few star designers who could do this. So I think being a little bit more humble about your role in society, but I think this also makes the work more, I think ultimately more satisfying. Because you're not aiming for this kind of like, I don't know, stardom that you hope that will be, you know, achieved someday, which is of course like the carrot stick idea, you know, but rather to understand that every kind of design, no matter how small, is important. You know, if it's important for one person, it's already relevant, you know, in itself. So I think this is, this kind of, listening to all these collectives made me quite more humble, but what it is to be a designer, and also what it means to be also practicing design in a meaningful way, and that you never win an award and you're completely unknown to the international design world is therefore completely fine. And maybe we should also not have that as a a goal in itself. So yeah, I hope that these things were insightful and helpful, and that was my story. Yeah.
Who has a question for Ruben?
Hi. Hello. Thanks a lot for the lecture. It was super insightful. It's more, I guess, not a question, but like a reflection. Like it's a controversial point in what you say, like, yeah, let's gather all together, don't do design for like smaller price, don't do bonuses and stuff like this, but then in the meantime, we still need to earn money somehow, and we still need to like keep going and, use design to earn for a living. And what, maybe you have any like advices for us at this point, how to maintain within these two controversial sides, at this point where we cannot really decide this on our own, And it's really not, how to say, we're not gonna gather all together and decide what's the price realistically. So, yeah.
No, I understand this is a question, of course, that is most asked. Nice utopia, but now what? So, of course, so practically, in the chapter about work, I give different examples of how people have resisted work in the past, how they have organized, what type of steps are possible within your power, right? I mean, I started working 5 days a week, and if you work 5 days a week, you're glad it's weekend. You're tired. What else can you do? And organizing, doing activism takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. Many people don't have that time, don't even have the luxury of having paid design work, let alone having work, etc. But I think, first of all, this is a question that people can personally ask themselves. I'm also not saying, by the way, that do this and do that. I'm saying this is what inspired me, and this is what I see these collectives doing, but what everybody can do individually will be very different in Barcelona, in Amsterdam, in Buenos Aires, right? I talked to a collective, Media Ninja, in Brazil. They are a group of activists. There are like 2,000 of them. They live in casas colectivos. Also, there's one in Portugal now. They don't make any money. They have accounts. They can spend a little bit of money, but they basically don't get paid. So everybody calls this self-exploitation. And I was talking. I went to some of their houses because they want to get rid of Bolsonaro because this is a problem, right? I mean, this is what they're fighting for. And I was like, people from the US are calling you, talking about self-exploitation. And they were like, but we have 3 meals a day. We have a roof over our heads. We live better than majority of people in Brazil. So, what you can do and what is possible in your personal thing and what you also want with your life is up to you, right? But I also ultimately have to say, we can keep seeing, so I don't know, like ultimately, the way that consumption is going right now, we can just keep on going. But in 3 generations, it will be finished, right? So do we party now or worry about later? And I'm not saying we're partying, but I think it's important to understand that we do have to understand that we need some kind of rigorous change in behavior. And that I think we have seen with also, there's a new COP climate summit coming up, that governments are not going to do this. Governments are not going to create the societal change that people, is needed to preserve at least part of humanity and part of the species. So ultimately, it's also a question of survival, you know? And I know that's not in your lifetime or in my lifetime, but it will be, at least in our lifetime, in different parts of the world very urgently, and we will see this. So, yeah, you know, ultimately, it's also a moment of crisis, you know? Like, I have to think about the only thing that I can think of that theoretically comes anywhere near is when the Netherlands was occupied by the Nazis. And the question was asked to designers, do you want to, if you want to receive commissioned work, most work was commissioned from the state, you have to pledge allegiance to the Nazi regime. So your question is then, do you do that or don't you do that? And do you go into the resistance and face persecution and you might die or not? Because they didn't know how long the war was going to last. They thought it was going to be 6 months or 3 months, you know? So these are the existential questions of morality that we have to ask ourselves. What is our role and our privilege in the current situation? And what can you do in your power to change that? But yeah, I'm not so hopeful in small changes like making this identity for this multinational a bit greener. You know, I think that is the opposite of what we need to do. I think the ultimate question is more about us as humans. How do we live and how do we consume and how do we do what we do? Than it is, what about design? Because yeah, that design is here, okay. It grew like that historically, that's an industrial profession, but it's not necessarily the only thing that design can be, I think. So for me, the hope is a little bit in this expansion of the idea of design. And right now, myself, I'm trying to find ways of using design in my own community in a meaningful way that can still create some kind of value, and people will still, you know, have a little bit of money for that. I don't need to be wealthy, but at least pay the production, etc. Right? So I'm trying to do that step by step, and as soon as I know more, I will let you know.
Thank you.
More questions?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Jeanne. I'm an interior architect, but I'm passionate about graphic design. And I have a question that is quite political, but I think this is quite political subject. How is graphic design going? Like, what's going on in the communist countries? Is there any graphic design? And don't you think that capitalism, the power of money, the identity, the need of individuality, it's what gave freedom to designers at the end?
You were saying communism?
Yes.
So
compared to capitalism.
Yes, I understand that. Yeah, Marx. I use a lot of Marx in my writing. I critique capitalism. He wrote the most dense critique that is actually embraced by all sides of the political spectrum. He came up with communism. I don't think necessarily that those are the only two ways to organize society, because we have to understand that these are both ideas that originate in Europe, and I'm not a big fan of ideas from Europe being implemented on other parts of the world, which is unfortunately what happened to a lot of communist countries. I don't think there's a lot of good examples or any good example of like an ethical communism or a communism that is. So I'm also not discussing that. I'm actually talking about that the exploitation under communism, especially Stalinism, was worse than under capitalism. So I don't think that. I would never advocate for that. And so this is the reason why I also didn't look into how design is organized, because I know that's where your question was going, or how it was organized maybe in the 60s and 70s, or maybe during the anarchist history of you know, and how that was organized. Well, also because I think the issue I have a little bit with modernity, and also my own position as writing about this, is that the idea is always we have to provide answers, right? There's a problem that is signified, so we have to find an answer, and I understand that. But I also want to avoid finding like one answer. So I think what is needed in the Netherlands is very different from what is needed in Ethiopia or in Brazil, or even locally. What is in my street needed in Amsterdam is something else that is needed in other streets. So and that doesn't mean I don't want to completely engage globally, because our consuming you know, our consuming behavior is global. So we have a global relationship, but we kind of forgot our kind of local relationship. So I think this relationship can be forged better. And of course, capitalism liberated the individual from patriarchy and the church and the feudal lords. This was, of course, super logical in that time. I mean, you know, you would be, if you would not be born in a rich family, you would die very young and you would be worth absolutely nothing. The finca system in America Latina, etc., right? Horrible, horrible. So it is only logical that the liberation of the individual comes with an, you know, it was a promise that everybody could become the best of themselves and also profit accordingly. And this is amazing. However, this is not historically what capitalism has done. Because otherwise, wealth would be very equally distributed in the world, which is not. And why is it that the same families that owned all the land in the UK in the 1600s still owned all the land today, right? Because when the switch of capitalism went, the factories were not just like created by, you know, farmers. No, they were created by people who already had money, which is the idea of the primitive accumulation concept, right? How did the first people who started capitalism created their money? Colonialism, slavery, and from the history of the feudal system, right? So you see that those old systems of accumulation still work through, and we still have, like, for example, in the Netherlands, a very stratified way of how money is organized. So there are still many families who have money from, you know, from many generations. They have real estate, they pass it on, etc. Because the type of capitalism that we have today, if you would actually take capitalism seriously, you would never give. Like, if you have property, it would never go to your children, because that would make no sense, because the market decides who is best. So in pure capitalism, all your money just goes away, you know, goes back into in the world. So we don't have perfect capitalism. We actually have a lot of like strange trade barriers. We have the EU subsidies, farm subsidies. So what we now have is also not pure capitalism. We have this strange capitalism where we have to defend with militaries and it's completely unequal, keeps kind of like this situation. So we're not liberating the individual, because we still see the same racism, sexism, colonialism now that we saw before, right? And at the same time, we started to forget about this importance of the collective, because the collective used to be a repressive form where the community is telling you what to do. You cannot be queer, you cannot be, you cannot work as a woman, you can not do all these things, right? Or you cannot even be Protestant, etc. So we should not forget the importance of the individual, because we all want to express ourselves, and individually it is part of human social makeup. But that doesn't mean that we can live by ourselves. Nobody can live by themselves. And now there's the idea that if only I'm wealthy, everything is going to be fine. But if you're the only wealthy person in the world, it's going to be horrible, you know? So we also kind of know that sharing more will also make us happier people. And especially I think neoliberal capitalism kind of killed like the last forms of kind of collectivity. And also we see now a kind of like capitalist dystopia where, now it's like if you go to a supermarket, it's not really the celebration of diversity. It's just like, my God, I have to read through all these labels and all these things and find the mess between all the important stuff, and to find like what is, it's like a dystopia. It's no longer a utopia, So I think I'm not advocating for communism. I'm not advocating for some kind of like totalitarian, but I do think there's much more than we can do than vote every 4 years. Because I think we can do things ourselves when we teach, when we work, when we are a student, when we talk to our friends, when we talk to our parents, when we talk to our neighbors, and we can do things that we cannot all leave to the state to solve or to the market to solve.
Questions, más preguntas?
Hello, Ruben. Thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to ask you about the problem of design education, because, for example, here in Spain, if you want to study graphic design, you have to pay like 10,000 euros for 1 year. And
for a Spanish national?
What? Sorry?
For a Spanish national, yeah, 10,000. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
In a private, yeah, because there's no many public institutions. So this fact, is a problem, because every designer has a lot of money, and I don't know, how do you see this problem? Like, it's a thing in the real world, or I don't know.
The problem of money, yes.
Yeah. But the fact that all the designers that design are pretty rich in some way, so it's like there's
the privilege. I understand. Yeah, your question. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, it changes a bit per country. Yeah, like actually, a lot of the former like former communist countries sometimes have, like, I mean, Argentina is did not used to be socialist or communist, but they have free design education. I think also Poland, Belgium, Germany have free design education. In the Netherlands, we have kind of cheap. It's like 2,000 euros. I mean, I still get students that come to me from Holland who are like, I wish I could study here, but I cannot afford it. My heart breaks. All education everywhere in the world should be free. I don't understand the concept of paid education. This is strange. Why do you only give rich people access to education is beyond my understanding. But yeah, this is the idea of neoliberalism and making everything into a product, whether it's water or air or education, right? But also I wrote a chapter about education where I point out that education only for a short time was actually, in Northern Europe, was free. Because education used to be only accessible to people of nobility, right? And only after World War II, it slowly opened up because there was a lack, after the destruction of the war, there was a lack of educated personnel at least in the Netherlands. This is when my father, he was the first in his family who went to university, got his school. And then when the gap was filled of skilled workers, they closed it again. And then it was like, let's make it more expensive, and now they're making it more and more expensive. Yeah, I mean, ultimately this is a vision on society, right? What is the role of education? We have now a neoliberal government in the Netherlands that believes that education should prepare people for work. So they wanted to cut art schools in half because people don't need artists. So we have to train more, I don't know what they want, but yeah, things they need in the economy. Yeah, this is not my opinion. I think education is a form of becoming adult, becoming human, learning about yourself and about others and your relationship with the world. That may be a bit romantic, but that's how I try to teach and what I try to do. Yeah, I mean, in the Netherlands, also in the school where I teach, I teach in English, we have an international school. So we have students from all over the world, but they don't come from the poor neighborhoods in my own city, right? And that's a shame. I don't have any power over that. That's like the way the government has kind of organized education. I do think it's really important that design education becomes accessible. In America, they use this system where, yeah, I mean, some rich students pay for the school, and then poor students who are very talented can go for free. I think that could work. It's not ideal, but at least give the opportunity. Because what I also point out in my, for me, ultimately also, look, if you are studying design, if you're going to be a good designer or not a good designer, I don't think that necessarily has to do with how much money your parents have, with other things. But what is a bit of the issue when design education is not diverse, and I'm not only talking about income, I'm also talking about gender, about race, about difference, and also about things like ableism and ageism, you know, if people want to study design if they're 30, is that okay or not, and all these things, right? Because designers will raise issues that they find important. And if you have a class of students who are mostly from wealthy backgrounds, then you will not see the problems that other classes face, or other ethnicities, or etc. So just by virtue of understanding the issues in society, it would be better if education is as diverse as the population that it produces, in my opinion, right? But I see, so it's like, yeah, that's an issue that most designers don't have power over, because you have the Ministry of Education and you have the school policy. So, I mean, you know, sending letters to your school, or demanding this or demanding that, or proposing things are ways to get involved in university work and to try to change universities. Most universities in Europe after 1968 have some kind of democratic process where at least it's possible. In my school now, students were complaining that all the teachers are freelancers, which is something is not good for the teachers, which they're trying to change right now. So if that's something at your disposal, then I would suggest using that. But I also think it's important to see education differently, and we have some really amazing writing from Latin America, from Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is undoubtedly translated in Spanish. I think I would, if you're interested in education, I think this is a very interesting book. That's really helped me. Also, Bell Hooks, Teaching to Transgress, is, I think, really amazing. So understanding education as a way of educating, not just necessarily commodifying education, which is more how I see my role, because I don't have power over that economic process, unfortunately. I think those are interesting sources. Ivan Illich also wrote very interesting books, Deschooling Society. So I would suggest reading those further if you're interested.
More questions?
As you were talking about education, maybe it would be convenient to start to encourage the people to make things aside, that it's what you are saying all the time, but understanding that education is credited and it's a commodity, in Europe at least, or in the countries that you were talking, no? that we are living. So maybe it could be convenient to encourage the people to self-organize and start to not understanding the education as something that is credited, that somebody is telling you what you have to learn, how you have to do it, and when, no? So would be like people that you have a bit of voice, would be interesting that you are encouraged, for me at least, or having that conversation now, that if it's something that you think that it may happen, that people start to organize themselves, to learn, and to have relationship with the people that we are living with, not only teachers that I am teaching to, that we are landing in the school, we are making our speech, and we are leaving. So we are coming back to our studios or to our houses. So, well, maybe a new kind of like school could be interesting to be thought at least.
Sounds amazing.
And are you have any thoughts about it, or are you trying to be involved in that kind of project somehow?
Look, I've been teaching in design for 10 years. I had many conversations about this topic. So part of the discussion is sometimes get rid of design schools. There's too many design schools. I was just taught today, there's too many design schools in Barcelona. They're just profit machines, producing designs as commodities, designers, right? But yeah, it's the right-wing neoliberal party in the Netherlands that wants to get rid of design education too, because we are having this conversation in design school. I mean, this is the only school that invited me in Spain. So I'm still happy we're here. I mean, we can point out all the bad things, but in my opinion, design schools are still places, at least in Northern Europe, which is where I studied, where places of dissent are possible. You know, in my school, we have black student unions, queer student unions. We have, you know, people speaking out against sexual misconduct. We have people talking about safe spaces. We have people talking about misgendering, you know, asking about rights for trans people, about using correct pronouns and all these things. These things are coming out of universities and schools. You know, so I find, and this is also what Bell Hooks says, look, there's many things wrong with education and how it's organized, but the people who are ruining education are not the teachers and the students, in my experience. Because the teachers and the students, I mean, I teach design, I don't do it for the money, you know, like I can pay my rent from it, yes, but it doesn't make you rich. In most countries, teaching design will not make you wealthy. Teaching design is not something you do because you like it. Studying design is usually also because you like it. So there's like a common, at least a common ground of understanding that there's a reason why we're here. We're not just watching the clock, right? And that is, for me, is already a space of empowerment, that we can have interesting conversations in design schools. There's at least some kind of space, because if we get rid of design education altogether, or art education altogether, I also feel we are going to lose some of these spaces. So as flawed as they may be, and as privileged as they may be, and hopefully we can transform those. Unfortunately, we have the European Bologna Accord, and this is horrible, and you know. But for example, in my school, nobody wanted to do grades. But we had to do grades because of the European Union. And now we convince the directors of the Department of Graphic Design, right? We convince the directors, we give a pass or no pass. And then whatever the person types in the computer, we don't care. Just make it a 7 or an 8 or I don't know. But so we don't have to do grading anymore. That's amazing. We just say pass or not pass, right? So then the process of learning becomes very different. So you can also decommodify within the system, right? So I do think although escape is in my subtitle not meant as a literal escape, it's a pun to the keyboard thing, the caps lock escape. But it's also a little bit that you have to find spaces within capitalist economic system and within society where things are still possible that are not necessarily organized only through economic systems. Because if I'm teaching and my time is up and I'm like, I'm not getting paid anymore, and there's still three students who want to talk to me, then I'm going to stay for an hour and a half more. All the teachers do that I know. So we're not so on paper we're all being perfect commodities, but in reality we are resisting that all the time, right? So that gives me hope that at least we can have this discussion. That means also there's a transformative power, because you will also find your places in society and bring those ideas with you that you create with your classmates, with your teachers. And that's also society. I mean, we are society. We're not like outside of it, So if we're thinking about this and talking about this, we're already doing this right here. So for me, this is already like let's say the positive aspect of the possibility of design education. But yeah, let's keep it at that. Yeah.
More questions?
Hi. Well, first, thank you for giving us your time. I think everyone here, we find your work very inspiring. And my question goes, why do you think people has lost their sensibility to nature about global warming if we are already living like the changes?
So you talk about like the sensitivity to global warming in a direct context, right? No, I mean, we are feeling the changes. There were floodings in the Netherlands like this year, but they are not as severe as in other parts of the world. And also, at least in the Netherlands, we have the money to, at least for a while, improve the dikes to keep the water out and have money to repair it, and other parts of the world don't have that. Also, we see like an alignment with privilege, right? So we see a rising inequality, and people who have more money have more access to protecting themselves from climate change, I mean, no matter how bad the situation gets, there are also always some billionaires, and they're already doing that, building bunkers in New Zealand with helicopter pads and food for 3 years. And I don't know how interesting that life would be by yourself or only with your family. I think we need more people around us to have a fulfilling life. But this idea that, I save myself and I don't care about the rest. And I think we see that in the wall we're building around Europe. This is a very clear example. We don't want to share. And people they know climate change is happening right now, and they know many people will come to Europe looking for a better life because we're not really helping them, So that's the reason why we're building fences and building drones, right? So that says something for me about the political way that we view global systems, right? So, I mean, that's a little bit my fear, is that because, there's people who have economically better, have also more access to media, and even globally, people in the global north have more, like my book is being printed, but many people say the same things and write the same things, but their book is not published. I have access to a publisher and all these things, and I can write in English. I have access to a language that many people can read, but what kind of people will it reach, and etc. So these kind of privileges, I think, are also related to things like climate change, and why we see a lack of. So we see enough like news about climate change, but we see a lack of, like enforcing that. And I mean, I'm recently interested in joining also Extinction Rebellion, because they have quite interesting ways of doing actions in the Netherlands. I mean, we have the biggest party in the Netherlands now. I'm not up to date on the Spanish political situation, but the biggest party in the Netherlands now is the right-wing party, and they're funded by Shell Oil. I mean, do I need to say more, And people vote for this party because they're afraid of losing their house, losing their job, losing what they have, losing their luxury, because they see that their children will have it less than they will have it. So everybody's afraid of losing their shit, and people get afraid, and when people get afraid, they start voting conservative or maybe even against their own interest in order to save some kind of idea, because the future is uncertain. And this is, I think, a very difficult thing to solve in terms of communication, because then, people say, yeah, but the left is only talking about identity politics and talking about pronouns. I just talked about pronouns, and like climate change is not like related to all these issues of like race and gender and, So I think this is, in terms of communication, one of the most important things that we have to really avoid, that the violent right, or just say the fascists, don't take this opportunity of like crisis and do another thing with it than maybe, I don't know, I want. Yeah.
Hi, Ruben. My name is Camila, and I have quite a technical question about the names, the way you organized the parts of your book, and why am I interested in that? Is that I always find it like somehow difficult, because now, while you were explaining, I was trying to understand why sometimes me as a designer, I was always segregating myself from the problems of the capitalist world, because I would see myself in a very disciplined way. So, and then when I became part of one cooperative, in the beginning I had some troubles with there, because it was difficult for me to understand my responsibilities, because I was trained to think in a very narrow way, that I work as a designer, and the designer does specific things that are making specific shapes, they are making the specific narratives, but they don't talk about the narrative, or nothing that happens in the moment of creating this whole work.
Certo.
Huh?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. No, so that, and then you somehow might oversee a lot of possibilities, the overseen zones of work when you are working within with the different professionals who have a specific disciplines there. And a lot of work are sometimes omitted in those moments. That sometimes you have a great idea, but then you couldn't communicate well as a designer to a person who gives you money from the foundation. And then it's like always those small moments that are happening under a very big umbrella of who wants the thing to happen, who gives you the money. I don't know if, I hope I make sense. And the problem arises in that moment when I realized that I really do see myself as a designer only. So then I kick out a lot of things that I could have been doing, because I see as a designer. And then once I became part of this, the cooperative that are doing the intersectional work, the feminist work in Central Asia, and I thought, like, am I, in those frameworks that I'm working, I don't really see myself a designer anymore, but I do still design, but I do feel like I do an activist work, but then I don't feel like yet enough to be an activist. And then sometimes you try to, you do a very important job within that cooperative for that specific community. And then when you try to explain yourself to some other people, I really get lost in trying to explain what I do, because there is no one single word that will explain in this kind of a capitalist way. And then I'm like, I'm not yet a designer, I'm not really like a person who does the community engagement, but neither blah, blah, blah. And then this is why I was a bit interested, because you were naming this, like designer as a philanthropist, designer as an activist, like, but it was always starting with a designer as, so it has the specification of a discipline. And I'm not sure what is your opinion about the discipline, if they're still needed or no, but just wanted to know your opinion, why it's working in this way.
So the idea of it's not, because there's sometimes this meme like, oh, the designer has to fill all these roles and we're asking more and more of designers. That's not the case. I'm just saying that designer is, I think, a role where you play different roles within the role of designer. And I'm talking about the industrialized understanding of design. So in terms, because I call myself a designer, I don't call myself an activist. If I do activist work, I do, but now I'm here as a designer. I think the problem is that design was kind of created as a separate discipline with the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, we cannot decouple it from industrial production. So we say, if there's no work, no paid work, and if there's no design degree, and if there's no client, there's no design. Coming back to the example from Cuba, for example, of somebody who's doing their own sign, right? But I would say that kind of completely ignores the history of visual communication. You know, we can write about a book about design that starts at the moment people started to create things, whether art or whatever. So I think we need to reevaluate the definition of what design is for me, that it does not only consider working for multinationals and making profits or having a design degree. I think people who don't have a design degree can also be designers, and people that don't have paid work can also be designers, right? So that will already kind of free design, but I understand your point. In the current society where we're thinking in division of labor and we have a specific understanding and you have so many professions, I know most people don't even know what a graphic designer does. It's one of our big frustrations. You know, like that's already such a frustration, people don't even know. And we have very limited agency in the design process I've been part of. I've been part of quite some not so nice design processes working for the Dutch government's relations with Russia or Turkey or these kind of authoritarian regimes. Yeah, I mean, you just make the design or you have to quit your job, right? This is the, yeah. You're not asked the opinion about the contents of the message you're doing. But at the moment, like you said, when you're trying to organize your own practice as a more, I don't like the word, but holistic, I guess, yeah. I mean, you as a person, like I said, if we would be a community right here, we would not need words like design, fashion design. People would just make stuff, you know? And maybe one day you're farming, and one day you're making shoes, and one day you're doing a poster, and at some point you get good at something, and we don't need to give it names. It's the compartmentalization of the division of labor and the industrial things that has created that, right? So that's why I'm also a little bit skeptical, or I didn't want to introduce like new terms like speculative design, social design, because ultimately those are industry terms, you know? So for example, very practical. So what is the first work? Actually, mostly now I'm doing like simple design stuff for the anarchist federation in the Netherlands. I do like leaflets where they translate workers' rights into Polish and Romanian because we have many Eastern European migrant workers. And I just make a leaflet on the A4 that they pass out. You know, translation is the most important thing. That's more traditional graphic design. But for example, I've been interested in defunding police and abolition of police. And every country has its own history, and most narratives are from the United States or the UK. So I started to research the history of the Dutch police. It's super interesting because it's really related to racism and slavery and colonial times, workers' repression, etc. And I wrote this article about it. And then a friend of mine said, yeah, but nobody is in your street is going to read this. And I was like, yeah, you're right. I should do something else with it. And I was like, why not make a comic book about it? So now I'm actually looking for I'm talking to an organization who is a cultural organization in the Netherlands who works out of Amsterdam East, which is a very mixed neighborhood. And I'm looking to find young people that actually engage with the police. So I mean, you know, certain neighborhoods, a lot of policing, and other neighborhoods less. So young adults or kids that have like a lot of experience with police violence or police, that they draw the cartoons. It can be a collective process. But yeah, I mean, I still see myself kind of as a designer. I produce visual communication, but maybe I will not be even touching it. I will just maybe scanning it in and helping with the organization of the storyline or, you know, something like that. And this will be a very difficult process because I probably have to work with 6 or 7 artists. But I think it could be super funny because I can just give out the comic books in my neighborhood and have a talk about police violence, you know. I think that would be amazing. So for me, that is visual communication. It's for the community. It's necessary, and it's not so expensive to make, you know. We can get some funding or via some organizations or some donations. So I don't know. So I see possibilities, but yeah, running an entire practice on this basis is a different story. I think you also have to probably, make a lot of less money. That's probably also part of that. But thank you for sharing your story.
Thanks for answering.
More questions? Job is done. Thank you very much.
Yes.